As Chris said, I'm going to talk about business taxes and as a potential tool, and this has, of course, been talked about as a way of dealing with some of the fiscal problems of the state of Illinois. And first I want to follow Julian's lead a bit and give some background on business taxes. What is a business tax and who pays it? And actually, economists, the whole notion of a business tax is something I think that needs a little bit of clarification. We tend to think of businesses as remitting taxes, that is, they write checks, but they don't necessarily bear the burden of the taxes. So the taxes that businesses actually pay have to fall necessarily on someone else, since a business is simply an institution. And they have to fall either on the owners of the firms, the customers, or the suppliers, or at least those are the three most likely places that business taxes could fall. And because of that, there's very little professional consensus about how businesses should be taxed as a general thing, because it depends a lot on which of these three groups you think bear the ultimate burden of these taxes. Which of these, so for instance, owners of the business might bear the burden if the profits of the firm fell. Customers might bear the burden if prices went up. Suppliers might bear the burden, including employees, for example, if wages fell when business taxes increased or employment decreased, perhaps. So what are the criteria for business taxes? These are the general criteria we have really for all taxes in looking at this. Economic efficiency of the taxes. To what extent do they make the economy work better? And there's some reason to believe that user fees equal to the cost of services that are consumed by businesses might encourage business expansion to the point where, to the optimal point, to the point where the cost incurs are equal to the benefits produced. So that one criteria is looking at how these taxes affect economic efficiency. The second criteria is vertical equity. Who bears the burden? Is it the people that are most able to join the burden, maybe the relatively wealthy? Is it poorer individuals, as Julia talked about with sin tax? That's an important issue in tax design. But with business taxes, where it's often unclear who bears the burden of the tax, the issue of vertical equity tends to get cloudy, and it's not clear that raising business taxes, it's not clear how that affects the distribution of burdens across, for example, income classes. A third really important issue with respect to business taxes is administrative efficiency. Businesses have a great capacity actually to collect revenue for business taxes and to remit that revenue. So for example, the sales tax, which we often think of as a tax on consumers, makes great use of businesses because they are in a good position, in particular retailers, are in a good position to collect revenues and to remit it to the government. And so one important reason for having business taxes is simply because they are an efficient way of gathering up the money. Another issue to think about with respect to business taxes is the stability of revenue. We want a system of revenue where we can predict how much revenue we'll get, and we can count on it from year to year. And as I'll talk about a little bit more, revenues, particularly from some business taxes, can be quite volatile. And so that's one of the reasons we might not want to be heavily reliant on business taxes, certain types of business taxes at least. Well, okay. What state and local taxes do businesses currently pay? And this is where I think there's a real difference in the views of people who are well informed about this topic and kind of the general public, and to some extent even legislators. The biggest tax that businesses remit by far, state and local tax, is the property tax. This accounts for, in Illinois, here you see figures from a study done by the consulting firm, the consulting firm Ernst & Young for Council on State Taxation. And it shows figures from Illinois and for the nation as a whole. In Illinois, nearly 40% of the business taxes paid are from the property tax. After that, the sales tax contributes 14%. Other kinds of excise taxes contribute about 16%. The corporate income tax, which gets probably most of the attention, contributes only 11% of the revenue that businesses pay. So when we think about business taxes, we should really think particularly about property taxes, and then to a lesser extent about sales and other kinds of business taxes. Okay, so certainly the discussion, Illinois has a large gap between projected spending and projected revenue, and one discussion has been about increasing taxes on business. And within this, I'm going to talk about 3 potential options for business taxes that we may want to consider. So one issue that's discussed is the corporate income tax, and broadening the corporate income tax base by eliminating some tax deductions. When we think about these kind of tax deductions, things that might make the corporate income tax base include more of the income that corporations receive, or we can go to something developed by the Illinois Comptroller called the a tax expenditure. Each year, the Illinois Comptroller publishes a list of tax expenditures and talks about how much revenue could be raised by eliminating each of them. The most important one is the net operating loss deduction, which allows the carryover of losses from previous years on current year's taxes. So if you have a loss last year and this year you have a profit, you can take that loss that you had last year and average it into the income that you had this year and reduce your taxes. The possible revenue effect from this is about $319 million per year. So to put this in perspective, this one change alone would raise about as much revenue as Julian told us could be raised from the increasing sin taxes. We might get another $300 to $400 million per year from other changes which broaden the corporate income tax base. And I'll talk more about the benefits and costs, or the advantages and disadvantages of doing that in a bit, but I want to move on to 2 other options. An alternative option, much bigger and more dramatic option, would be to create an all-new tax, such as a gross receipts tax or a value-added tax. These are taxes that some other states have. New Hampshire, Ohio, Texas, Washington have some kind of tax such as this. Most other highly developed countries, and most countries in the European Union, have a value-added tax or a VAT. This kind of tax could be introduced in Illinois. There was a 2007 proposal under Governor Blagojevich for an Illinois gross receipts tax. It went to a resounding political defeat, but it was estimated it could bring in $7 billion of revenue annual. So you're talking about an order of magnitude different compared to relatively minor changes in the corporate income tax. Obviously, we wouldn't have to have a value-added tax that brought in that much revenue. We could scale it down, or we could use it to replace all or part of the corporate income tax. A third potential option is to create a statewide property surtax on business. So we currently have a property tax statewide. The Illinois Department of Revenue aids in the administration of this. Some of the work, a lot of the work is done at the county level, but it's monitored at the state level. And it certainly would be possible to have a statewide property tax. Arkansas, Washington, Michigan, and Minnesota already have statewide property taxes. The only one that has a special property tax on business is Michigan, and it's relatively small. So we would be doing something that was rather unusual in the nation, but certainly not unprecedented. How much revenue could we raise with this sort of tax? According to the Illinois Department of Revenue, there's about $100 billion of commercial and industrial property statewide. So a relatively modest tax of 1% on these properties would raise about $1 billion. So we're talking about potentially a lot of revenue. Currently, businesses pay about $8 billion in property taxes. So this would be, a reasonable increase in the tax. I should say that this would hit not only corporations, but all businesses with this tax. So I'm running out of time. I want to talk a little, just very broadly, very quickly about the effect of these on other objectives. If we would broaden the income tax base, we might change the way corporations react to that by reporting differences, essentially evasion, or there might be a change in business practices. The relatively modest changes I've talked about here would have probably small changes in business practices. Creating a new tax, as I said, would treat all businesses, whether they're corporate or non-corporate, uniformly, and would also tax businesses regardless of whether it was profitable, and it's controversial whether that's a good or a bad thing. Very difficult to say very much about the distributional effects of the policy options that I've talked about, because we would have to know a lot more about and do a lot more study of exactly how these taxes would interact with the competitiveness in various markets. It's very unclear what the distributional effects would be.